Hello, my name is Jeremy Nienow. I'm a principal investigator here at Nienow Cultural Consultants. And today I'll be presenting along with Laura Koski on a recent project that we completed called the Camp Ripley Sentinel Landscape Comprehensive Literature Review. This was a project done with funding from the Minnesota Legacy Amendment. And today we'll be going through a brief overview of what the project was, and then Laura will be demonstrating the actual GIS database that we built for this project. If you have questions related to this video once you've watched it, please don't hesitate to reach out to Nienow Cultural Consultants. Our email address here is Jeremy, that's Jeremy, .Nienow, Nienow, @gmail.com. All right, let's begin. So first I want to begin by thanking the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, the Legacy folks, for awarding this project to Sylvan Township. The grant, the specific grant is listed here, and this presentation today in part was funded through the Legacy Amendment as part of a large match project. Nienow Cultural Consultants is making this presentation on behalf of Sylvan Township today, and I hope you enjoy it. So I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about what the Sentinel Landscape is. Currently in the United States, there are 7 such Sentinel Landscapes. This one surrounds Camp Ripley, a military training facility in north central Minnesota. Essentially what it creates is a 800,000 acre buffer that surrounds the camp. And this buffer is primarily created by natural environmental boundaries. And the purpose of this boundary is to create a buffer between development activities and the camp's activities for the purposes of safety and for the purposes of preservation of the landscape and environment. Many of the activities that have been undertaken by the Camp Ripley Sentinel Landscape have been around environmental factors. However, beginning a couple of years ago, the advisory board recommended that they do a cultural resource landscape survey to determine, besides natural resources, what cultural resources were also in the environment, with the purpose leaning towards preservation and understanding of these on the landscape. The Camp Ripley Sentinel Landscape is a large, vast tapestry of groups, including federal, state, county organizations that are all working together for one goal. And this also includes tribal stakeholders as well, and general members of the public. The Sylvan Township Board worked together with the Camp Ripley Sentinel Landscape Advisory Team to develop an RFP, a request for proposal, that went out to a variety of different cultural resource management companies to produce a comprehensive literature review. What a literature review is it is an understanding of everything that's available culturally within a landscape, what's already known to the public. This can mean archaeological sites, this can mean standing structures, this can mean interesting historical events and activities, and general pieces of history that have happened throughout the years that are all within that buffer zone around the camp. Much of this information was recorded by state agencies and is housed there, specifically at the Office of the State Archaeologist and at the State Historic Preservation Office. However, there are lots of pieces of information that are not known to the state that are only known at the local level, maybe at a county historical society or even within a local city. So this project was focused on gathering together all of those pieces in one place so that the people that are working within this Sentinel Landscape will have a much better understanding of what the cultural resources are within the overall project. Nienow Cultural Consultants work together with a variety of team members, which I'll be talking about here in just a moment. And we came up with the idea of producing a GIS geodatabase, which is a way to visually show the layout of as many different pieces of information as possible, and basically reflect the fact that this landscape has many layers to it over time, and that the project would encompass many different capabilities and avenues for its work. So Nienow Cultural Consultants, along with multiple other groups applied to do this work, and ultimately NCC was approved to complete the work. In doing this work, we pulled together a comprehensive team that not only included project managers and professional archaeologists such as myself, but also industrial and historical specialists like Fred Sutherland, GIS specialists and archaeologists in their own right, Laura Koski, as well as local historians such as Jeremy Jackson, seen here with Doug Burke, who was a longtime archaeologist working in central Minnesota and unfortunately passed away a few years ago. So our core team was a group of professionals that had both archaeological and historical knowledge of the overall Sentinel landscape. We expanded this to include members of the architectural history community, Tamara and Laurel, that are coming to us from Pigeon Consulting, Barry Madore, a videographer, so that he could record everything that we were doing and produce a series of videos, and as well as a tribal consultant, Anastasia Walhoff, who's an enrolled tribal member and worked to help us communicate with our tribal partners throughout this project. It's critically important to know and realize that all of our work is taking place on lands that were once tribally owned properties, and that over time, through treaty and other actions, they came into Euro-American hands. So the cultural landscape invariably must include a tribal component. Our project was divided into 3 different steps: a 50% complete plan, a 75% complete step, and then a 100% complete, which is where we're at currently. This presentation is part of that 100% complete step. The first part of the 50% complete was really focused on gathering together everything that we could from our landscape. So that included, first of all, just calling and emailing and reaching out to every different entity we could find, both at the state, county, and local level, starting to pull together research, what we already knew about the landscape and what we didn't know yet, and reach out to all those different entities, produce a video that introduced us to the public and post it on our website, start working on understanding and defining the boundaries of our work, reaching out to our tribal partners, and basically getting the grant underway. Any legacy project, especially one of this size, must have a component that incorporates understandings from the Minnesota Historical Society. And it's really important to keep them informed of all the work you're doing. One of the conditions for this project, for example, was producing a report telling them where we were, a status update, if you will. So we completed all of that in our first step. It took the first 3.5 to 4 months of work. We've been working on this project for almost a year now. So the first 4 months were dedicated just to going out and seeing what was available. Then in the next step, we gathered together all of that data and we incorporated it into our GIS model, the thing that you'll be looking at here in just a little bit when Laura does her presentations. We also started to realize that we had gaps in our information. There were places that we just couldn't see, either by looking at Google Street View or looking at some photography that was online. So we had to go there. Our experts in the field, historians and archaeologists and architectural historians, started traveling throughout the region, taking pictures of properties to make sure they could be added, finding all those gaps in our data, incorporating that information back into the database. We continued to make videos. We started reaching out to the public and going to open house events. Really started getting into the meat and potatoes of this project. This was definitely the most engaging part of the overall project. As we got into the final step, the 100% complete, which is really focused now on doing presentations and giving thank yous back to the public for helping us to gather all this data, we found that we had a whole series of successful things that happened in this project. First, we've created a dynamic, pretty darn incredible GIS database, which you'll be seeing in a moment. We've shown it to multiple agencies at the state level, the county level, and local levels, and everyone has been amazed by the type of data that you can find in this database. We want individuals to be able to gain access and use this for their own research purposes, and ultimately this information will be shared and housed at the Office of the State Archaeologist and at the State Historic Preservation Office, and will be used primarily by Camp Ripley as part of the Camp Ripley Sentinel Landscape Advisory Team. So, one, we produced a big new tool that everybody can use when they're looking at visual data, spatial data within the database. We also made great inroads with talking with tribal members, listening to local historians and others, and really finding those things that made them passionate in the landscape. The state level has a lot of data, but they have an entire state to think about, and they're not really focused on one particular area. But local historians, especially in Little Falls and Brainerd, are particularly interested in their own backyard, and their stories were the most interesting for us to collect. At the end of this project, we were able to reach out to other broader partners like Great River Greening and the Mississippi Headwaters Board and others, Army Corps of Engineers, who have realized the potential for this project. So there's been a lot of cross-pollination, and hopefully others will consider developing GIS geodatabases in the future. This is a static image of what the geodatabase looks like. On the left, you'll see in the center Camp Ripley itself. You'll see the boundary of where our Sentinel Landscape was and the 800,000 acres that's inside of it. All these little yellow dots represent information that we already knew about the Sentinel Landscape based on state records. All the blue information are places that our own architectural historians, archaeologists, and historians gathered from local sources. So that's a huge influx of information about this database. Some of the example places that we found were included old railroad lines where trees have grown up on each side, and all that remains, even though the rail line's been removed by now, the environment still reflects that. We also did local talks with historians when we went to places like Brainerd to find out about events that were important to them that we should definitely include in this database. And we did an open house public archaeology event up in Pillager where we incorporated members of the Sylvan Township Board, Great River Greening, volunteers from the city of Pillager, and professional archaeologists to work on an archaeological project within the boundaries of the Camp Ripley Sentinel Landscape. We did, however, have a series of challenges. The largest of these challenges obviously was COVID. When we began our project, COVID was well underway and we could not access state government properties. We couldn't go to the Office of State Archaeologists. We couldn't go to the State Historic Preservation Office. We had a hard time getting into county historical societies and others. And until those things eased, we relied exclusively on digital information. We could go out and gather some of our own data, obviously, in the field. And once things warmed up, we really spent a lot of time out there. Slowly, as things thawed for us, though, we started to get access to the St. Cloud State Archives, where the Doug Burke collection is at. We started being able to get into county historical societies, and we were able to then ultimately get digital information from both the Office of the State Archaeologist and the State Historic Preservation Office so that we could begin the laborious process of checking what was already known with what was not known in the landscape. So COVID was a problem. Gaining access to data was difficult. And we had a lot of varying types of information that required us to cross-check information. Over time, properties have changed names, addresses have changed within locations. All those things can lead to problems in the geodatabase. And Laura Koski, our specialist, had to overcome those challenges and did a great job. Finally, although we were paid to do this project pretty much full-time, we couldn't always work on it full-time, and we had a lot of different timeline pushes and pulls from various partners throughout the project. Not everyone could give us their attention at any one time, so we needed to stagger our efforts throughout the year. It's a good thing we had a year to get it done. I wouldn't have wanted to try this with only 6 months. So where do we come for now? Well, first, we've given more than 13 presentations to different groups over the course of the last 2 months, telling people about the project, getting that information out there. We're producing a public report, which shows information about how we did the project, the overall summary results of the project, and where you can gain access to this information to do your own research. And we've started seeing places where we can improve this product moving forward. It's very important to remember that this data is only as good as the information that was put in and the information that gets updated and maintained in the future. It's going to be very important for Camp Ripley to continue to maintain this data, and as other county and state entities find more things on the landscape, that those things also get incorporated into this database. But just in giving the presentations themselves, we've heard back from tribal partners with expressing an interest in getting tribal information. added into the geodatabase. Things like place names. We've also heard varying degrees of interest in small parcels, small snippets of the overall project. Where does my research goal lie within this overall landscape? And everybody can gain access to this data if they are able and willing to go through the steps to get it, which again will be through the Office of the State Archaeologist, the State Historic Preservation Office, or through Camp Ripley. At this time, we're going to take a look at the database itself. Bear with us for just one moment.
All right, so I'm getting the GIS hooked up here for you. I'm Laura. I was introduced at the beginning of the video. I'm going to be introducing how this database looks in the GIS, how it looks in the map viewer, and also a little introduction to how someone can actually use the information and how the data is distributed between the metro areas of the project area and all the other rural areas around that. So now that it's loading in, I'm going to pop over. Okay, and here we are in the GIS viewer. This is how it's going to pop up to somebody using this on their desktop. This is used in ArcGIS Pro. It can be utilized in other formats, but the geodatabase itself is only usable by Esri products like ArcGIS Desktop or ArcGIS Pro. So this boundary we're looking at, we were introduced to earlier in the video. This is the CRSL project boundary. It's created by a series of rivers, watersheds, township boundaries and things like that. And this is supposed to all be like Jeremy was saying before, kind of like the donut around the donut hole of Camp Ripley here in the middle. So for this project, Camp Ripley itself is not included. They have their own geodatabase that their GIS team uses. And this is all meant to be just strictly around the Camp Ripley reservation. So anything in this boundary, we didn't look to seek data out. You'll see some things do overlap that, but just because it wasn't practical to clip out the center of the project area here. So when it comes to the layers that fill this in that we collected throughout the project, there are 3 different varieties of layers. We have the cultural, which is one that required the majority of the research going out to historical societies and digging through archives. The second variety is environmental layers, which includes all of the kind of natural environments, geology, vegetation, hydrography, and things like that across the project area. And the third are basically reference layers to help a user navigate themselves to the project area and either find out where they want to go or where they are when they've pinpointed a specific resource. So for your sake, being able to navigate, seeing where we are in the landscape, I'm going to pop in one of our reference layers. This is the satellite background image, which will help some of you sort of figure out where you are in this landscape. We have Lake Mille Lacs over here. We have Gull Lake and a series of lakes up here. And I'll pop on another reference layer. We've got our cities and townships. So Brainerd, here we see Brainerd, East Gull Lake, Little Falls down here, Royalton. You can also navigate by county, and here's how you can see a really specific county distribution. Morrison clearly takes up the majority of the area, followed by Crow Wing and Cass, and lastly Todd County over here, and even more specific breakdowns of township. So these are township borders. I have them all labeled so they overlap each other a little bit. But for instance, down here, you can see the specific boundaries of Ripley, Belle Prairie, Little Falls Township versus Little Falls the city, Green Prairie, etc. And that can be further broken down by township range and section. So we already know these larger squares are the townships themselves, and then these smaller orange squares inside of them are the sections from each township and range. So that can help a user navigate if they need it. And so I'm going to remove some of this noise and we move on and see the rest of the information here. The next thing I usually do, I will pop down to look at the environmental and we'll leave the cultural for last. But 2 of the reference layers that also overlap the sort of cultural and environmental categories are two base maps that we created for this. So I'm going to take this off. Well, we've got three actually. One LiDAR you could consider mostly environmental. We have a LiDAR hillshade covering the entire project area. It is a deep relief, and the user can actually change how the lighting angle works. Right now I have it at a 25-degree azimuth, which means if you're looking at the sun starting at the ground surface and 90 degrees above the ground surface, we're at a rather low angle, which helps highlight low features, like things like this. And a user can decide if they want to change that angle. If they want it higher, things will look lighter. It helps highlight tall features. They can make it lower if you want to highlight low pit features or foundations. So the user has full flexibility to do that. Next, we have historic mapping as backgrounds. We've got the trig historical maps that were generated using things like the GeoLo plat maps, which are the next ones up, but also including other environmental information for specific areas. You can zoom in, it's still quite sharp. For instance, we have Hole in the Day's house, generally along the Mississippi River. The original Camp Ripley military reservation boundary coming out this way and squishing into Mississippi River again, Fort Ripley military roads, all of these things you can see in this trig map. And then we have a different version of historical map being the General Land Office Public Survey Maps, or GLO maps, which all come in their own hues. So it looks like a bit of a patchwork. But all of these maps were taken in and georeferenced to their location on the ground, which you'll see actually do line up with township range section. So township boundaries tend to line up with these GLO maps. That's how they were drawn in. And they're the first survey maps of the US for the most part. So the glimpse we get with GLO is a very original view of the landscape before settlement came in, before Euro-Americans started to introduce their farm fields, deforest, redirect streams to irrigation pathways, drain lakes to populate. So we get a more original view of the landscape, what it would have looked like pre-settlement for the most part. But you still do get some early on additions, such as we can see again on this map, the Fort Ripley military road, once it zooms in here better, coming through this way. So we get a few of the original pathways, things like the Ox Cart Trail coming across here, which in this map they call the Otter Tail Road, or Otter Tail Trail, depending where you read it. Otter Tail Road here, coming through Sylvan Township. Yeah, so a lot of the information that we have for the cultural layer and the environmental layers are pulled from maps like this and like the trig map and elevations like the LiDAR hillshade. So a lot of what you'll see will end up being sort of extrapolated either by us or other entities like MnDOT and MNDNR. So we're gonna move on. The environmental layers, there's a lot of options out there for what you could include environmentally. We did not generate anything from scratch ourselves for the environmental data. Everything was pulled from MnDOT or DNR, because they already have a lot of their own data, and then it was cut down for this project area boundary. Specifically things that required permission, we did seek permissions and they were granted. A lot of things are considered open access or public use data and do not require specific written permission. So anything here falls under those two categories. We have a few options. There's curated one for helping aid potential predictions of archaeological sites of where there could be high potential, as well as understanding the contemporary state of hydrography and vegetation across the project area. And then falling sort of between those two of where are areas of potential protection for natural resources? Where are we seeing strong resources that have not yet been disturbed by European settlement? And those things all kind of overlap. So for instance, we have a pre-contact hydrography layer, and this was created by MnDOT to help create their predictive model. This is sort of a rough estimate of hydrography between the contact period and all the way back to 12,000 years ago. So it's not necessarily what it always was during the pre-contact era, but at the same time, it's sort of a prediction of what it was like before European settlers came in and modified the landscape. Similarly, we have pre-contact vegetation via Marshner, who had a statewide map of potential pre-contact vegetation. You'll see these overlaid here. Beyond that, we can go and look at where areas of vegetation have not yet been disturbed. So we have old growth forests. These are smaller areas. We can see one here, a few popped up over here. Let's throw on contemporary hydrography and water bodies to give some perspective, Gull Lake and such. And then we have native plant communities. So where are areas of vegetation that have also not been disturbed beyond just old growth forests? We have prairie lands and grasslands. We have a large amount of these scattered across the project area, actually. On top of that, where are certain resources that people might have been pursuing in the pre-contact era? And so we've also got lakes highlighted as wild rice lakes if they had those resources. We can see that in the tan. And on top of that, we have natural springs, which would have definitely been sought after. And those are symbolized by these blue dots across here. So for instance, if you're looking at, we've got a native plant community, which has been undisturbed, and it's right next to a lake that had produced wild rice, you would think, well, yes, there would be potential for archaeological sites in this area that have not yet been disturbed. And whether or not it's been surveyed is a different question, but at least it helps highlight areas to better keep in mind when it comes to what are we looking to protect and preserve in this project area. So that's kind of a snapshot of the sort of information you'll see in the environmental layers. So we're going to pop up to the cultural, which I'm sure is what a lot of people expect this to be entirely about. So we're going to focus on culture for the last part of this. Oh, I still have the forests up. Let me just take that off. So overall, I'm going to drop in everything that was researched for the project area, all the information that was gathered and collected. And that includes, up here, we got recorded archaeological sites. Let me actually drop this on top of the satellite for you, so you have that reference material. Archaeological sites, historic districts, historic standing structures, historical standing linear features. This can be rail lines, pathways, and roads. We have resources of cultural potential. So these are the points that dropped in for that. Areas of cultural resource potential, linear features of cultural resource potential. Again, these would be paths and roadways or rail lines that have been pulled up in the past. And so these can overlap in some places because some things have been replaced since. And then we also have traditional cultural properties and tribally informed potential traditional cultural properties that have been provided to us via information and communication with tribes. And we also have an unrecorded burial sites layer. There's only 2 of these. And then it moves on into more modeling information that was provided by MnDOT. So what we're looking at in front of us, I'm going to get you some tallies. For all of the information you're looking at in here that was researched and gathered and dropped in, there are 1,749 features in total that you're looking at. And that breaks down to 369 archaeological sites as of when we recorded this. That might be updated before this is finally submitted. That's topped off with 1,165 historic structures and 249 points and areas and lines of cultural resource potential. Now, to break that down, between the archaeological sites and the historic structures you're looking at, the grand majority of that, all archaeological sites that we pulled are already recorded with the Office of the State Archaeologist, so these are formally recognized. The great majority of the yellow dots, the historical standing structures, are inventoried at SHPO. So all this information is considered the known resources that we have in here. The blue dots, the turquoise areas, and the orange lines are all things that had not yet been previously recorded with either of these agencies. So these all represent areas of potential information that haven't been investigated yet. These are pulled from archives at the historical societies, county level, local level, as well as like the Doug Burke collection at St. Cloud State University, like Jeremy had brought up, was a plethora of information because this was really one of his central areas of interest when it came to logging railroads, lumbering camps, things like that. And so our researchers were able to help pull Burke's research out of the archive and drop it into something that helped network it all together and pull it all into one space and organize all of those maps and photographs and articles to different points on the landscape. So for instance, the unrecorded burial sites, which you'll see, they're kind of hard to see. There's only 2 orange dots, but these are unrecorded burials that Burke had known about and identified as potential. There's one diphtheria grave, and then there's one of an individual that he identified. So these are mostly dropped in to help, if there was ever potential development in these areas, do we know what's here already? And is it something that we really need to avoid? And all that information can help the Sentinel Landscape team actually help protect the landscape, and it gives them more and more fodder to understand the landscape and therefore protect it. So let's break this down a bit. I'm going to take some of this off because it gets a little bit noisy. We're looking at some specific areas. So let's start in Little Falls. Little Falls is a grand example of what happens when you have a local historic preservation commission. And you can see here, actually, over 400 of the historic structures in the project area are in Little Falls alone. You can see by this focus here how many land in the town. They also have several archaeological sites landing within their town, a historic district here, and also the commercial district in the center of town. And all of this overlapping together really helps understand not just the historic value of Little Falls, because both of these districts are historic. This is the Charles Weyerhaeuser house and the Drew Musser houses, and then the commercial district in the middle, all of the other structures that weren't necessarily considered part of the district because they weren't old enough at the time. They could be today, that could be part of an update. And also the prehistoric value of what's in this town, of what happened here before European settlers created Little Falls as it's known. And even up here we have an example, this blue dot, meaning it's an area of cultural resource potential identified during this project. If you're wondering what that could be, we can open a pop-up and we see here, oh, this is a stone quarry. And in fact, I'll bring this up because I remember this. This point was actually found in the Burke collection. And this map up here is Burke's map that he had drawn on to point out, yes, I found this quarry here, and we've included that here in the database. So all of these things, like this point I clicked on, the archaeological sites, historic structures, all these lines, if you click on it, you'll get this pop-up. And that'll bring up all the information we found during the research stage. And it's broken down by cultural period, cultural context, cultural function. All of these values are very searchable. Everything uses standardized language, so it's easy to query across the entire project area. Short descriptions that give you some background information. And if it's available, everything has attachments. So for instance, because this was a previously not formally recorded site, the attachment includes a map created by Burke. But for other things like the archaeological sites and the historic standing structures, their attached files would be the formal archaeological site forms and the SHPO inventory forms that correlate to that point or area. So even when you have the information attached, you can open it up. So I'm just going to open up this map that he made. And then we can pop the screen sharing over to that. It's a little rough because it's been clearly scanned multiple times over. But you see he points to Stone Quarry. And then go back to the map view. There we go. And what's really cool now is once we've figured out a spot we want to look at more, you can drop in the information we already have. So we've got trig maps here, and we can see Trig also had pointed out the Stone Quarry, and he gives more of a boundary to it. We can see in the GLO that they have also identified this quarry. I have to zoom in closer to it because it's a smaller label. There we go, Stone Quarry right here. And then what's more interesting is if we want to see what this cutout looks like today, how did it affect the landscape? What's that scar like in the landscape along the river? We can take this off and look at the LiDAR hillshade, and we can actually see it in relief. So you can see this boundary of the quarry right here cut out. So if someone's looking to manage this landscape today, they have basically a precise boundary for what that could have been. All right, so another example we're going to look at for future potential and research directions, for instance, is the Brainerd area. And to help lead us there, I want to highlight another really cool thing our researchers did. So let me remove some of these points because they can get a little distracting. Take out these. All right, so one thing they also did beyond just the areas of potential resources that have not yet been recorded, they also found historic standing structures that are not yet recorded with SHPO itself. So things that are still standing, still visible, still in use, but not in any formal inventory. And to do this, I'll highlight one of the querying functions of this database. Let's look at the attribute table where all of the information is stored for that layer. And then we can run a query. So that would be considered select by attributes. And in this layer, there's a column for whether something is listed by SHPO or not. And so we're going to select that column on SHPO record is equal to no. We'll apply that. And then we can see on the bottom 90 selected. We can go over to see just those selected things. So all of this information is not yet on SHPO's radar, and definitely should be. A lot of these things are still standing and still have a lot of historic value. They wouldn't have been listed in this project if they didn't, but aren't yet on any sort of protective radars or maybe town development, things that could be refurbished or fixed up a little bit. So let's see where these land on the landscape. All of these turquoise dots are all of the structures that were not yet on the record. So this is what came up with the query when we selected no for that field. So they're scattered rather evenly across the project area, but we can definitely see there's a concentration of them over in Brainerd. So let's zoom into that. It's almost a half and half. The yellow is stuff that is currently listed on the SHPO record. Blue is everything that is not currently listed. And so you can see there's a lot of potential for stuff that is just not on the radar yet. And we know that the city of Brainerd is interested in getting these on the radar. Brainerd itself has been overlooked a lot. They don't have their own historic preservation commission like Little Falls, which is why we see these big differences. But getting to actually put this information out on a map and having the disbursement, being able to see how it networks all together, really helps highlight the differences and what happens when you do and don't have these local authorities helping take care of these things on the ground at the local level. All right, so I'm going to clear that. Another cool thing you could do, like I said, everything in here has standardized searchable abilities. So for instance, if you wanted to see, let's pull up the cultural resource potential layer. Give you an example of that. All right, I'm going to take off the districts. So let's see what we could search with here and see how things distribute across the landscape. So I'm going to give you an example. We're going to go back to a querying function. And let's see what kind of cultural functions we can find here. This drop-down list gives you all of the options of what you could be searching for. If it's in here, it means there is something associated to that cultural function somewhere in this layer. So we could look for all ghost towns. That would be fun. Ghost towns are a really cool feature of this project, especially because some of them were pulled from the OSA files, but those files are just, they're not technically officially recorded archaeological sites, and it can often be forgotten because they cover broad areas that are ill-defined bounds. But here we were able to actually highlight things like this. So our one selected ghost town is Platte Ghost Town. So let's go explore that. And we can zoom right to it. So I'll show you to do that. We will zoom to, so we see it's over here. All right, so this is where a ghost town should have been. Can we get more information on it? We'll click the point and see Platte Ghost Town. We get this information. We get a description, late 19th to early 20th century ghost town along Platte River to support the logging industry, etc. And if you wanted to get more information, we point you to this book by Horst Hannigan, Weighted Memories and Forgotten Legacies. So things like that are a really neat feature of this. If you're interested in anything in particular, it's searchable. If you're trying to just look in one location, you have all the reference material to get you to that location. And it's very functional, it's very versatile, very editable, and most importantly, for anyone who ends up using this in the long term, it also has to be maintained and kept up. And that includes like archaeological sites. They're only as accurate as, well, currently March 2022. Once March 2022 is over, we can't keep updating the archaeological sites, and several could be added year to year. Once that is no longer maintained, it loses its specific accurate functionality. So it can be an interesting research tool, but it shouldn't be relied on for management purposes at that point. So I'll drop these in just to give you a final last look. All of these features you can see on the landscape. And on top of that, we also have the MIN model, which is the predictive model of most likely areas to find sites and run into them, overlaying all this. We can even already see just dropping this model in. some of that spatial distribution of how things land over high predicted areas, red being high potential. So yeah, that's a quick look at the landscape, the geodatabase, and the kinds of material you could find within the Camp Ripley Sentinel Landscape. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy again to finish this out.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for being here today and taking a look at our video. Again, if you're interested in learning more information about this, you can either contact us at jeremy.nienow@gmail.com, or you can reach out to Camp Ripley or the Office of the State Archaeologist or the State Historic Preservation Office. All those entities will have access to this data. And again, I want to thank the Minnesota Legacy Amendment for their generous support of this project. I'd like to thank Sylvan Township in going after the grant and ultimately awarding it to NCC. This has been a highly enjoyable, productive project to work on. We've made great contacts with a variety of different entities, both at the state, county, and local level. We've had the opportunity to find and explore lots of regions in the state where people have maybe overpassed them for a while, but there are passionate people in those places, and there certainly are interesting things on that landscape, both for Native American and Euro-American settlement of the region. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you all.